On June 5th, 1922, at nearly the same time Naka was started, Japan declared war on Archimedes and laid down the 2,936-ton experimental light cruiser Yubari. It really wasn't a fair fight. The Japanese had access to some of the most advanced shipbuilding technology. They had a fighting spirit that was unmatched. They had a population of tens of millions. Archimedes, on the other hand, had been dead for 2,100 years and only had that funny math with letters in it regarding buoyancy and stability. Like I said, it really wasn't a fair fight. I am, of course, talking about the effect of top weight on lateral stability, metacentric height. So what is metacentric height? Why do I bring it up? And why do I bring it up here, you might ask? Basically, very basically, metacentric height is the vertical center of gravity on a ship. From a fighting standpoint, you want to make ships as narrow as possible. This reduces drag and improves hydrodynamic efficiency, which lets a ship go faster, and because it doesn't have to push aside as much water, it means it uses less fuel, which in turn means it can go further. Less machinery and burning less fuel also means the ship is cheaper to build and operate. Remember, Japan's economy was straining to build at the scale and rate of the US and Britain. In the same vein, it also makes sense to make ships as light as possible because less weight means less mass to move, which again means faster and more fuel efficient. So the larger or heavier and wider the hull, the slower the ship or more engines needed to push it. The more fuel it will burn, which means a shorter range and that much less weight that can be devoted to weapons. Also, and this was the key point for Japan, being warships, you want to get as large and as many weapons up on the deck where you can use them as possible, especially since in a war with the US, the Japanese were probably going to be outnumbered. So they wanted ships as heavily armed as they could to be qualitatively superior to make up for their quantitative inferiority. So, from an operational point of view, they wanted ships that had lots of weapons up high, were narrow, as light as built as possible, and cheap. Not so fast, said Archimedes, holding this picture in hand. The narrower the hull and the more weight you have higher, then the higher your vertical center of gravity. Since gravity likes to pull things straight down and water isn't going to give it much resistance, this means as soon as your ship rolls or is rolled, the vertical center of gravity will swing like a pendulum and the ship will roll right over. And that is exactly what happened on March 12, 1934, in the infamous Tomozuru incident. Low on fuel, the torpedo boat Tomozuru, which carried 3 5-inch guns and 4 torpedo tubes on a mere 600 tons, capsized in a storm. Archimedes had won. And that is why you don't stand up in a canoe. Now, why do I bring it up here? The answer is simply, as hinted at, because with Yubari, the Japanese began to experiment with building ships that were dangerously top-heavy and lightly built. Again, this was to get as much firepower as possible out of each ship. When they realized they had dared too much, ships already built had to have weight added low, subtracted from high, widened, or all of the above. It was a problem that haunted them right up to the start of the war. But wait, we're not done yet. Remember that lightly built as possible part? Yeah, that was a problem too. Starting with Yubari, the Japanese set about using the hull of the ship as armor. That is to say, rather than hanging plates of armor onto the side of the ship's side was made thicker to act as armor. More importantly, the ship's longitudinal, bow to stern, frame was as thin as possible to save weight. Too thin as it turned out. Also, soon electric welding was used, an art the Japanese hadn't quite mastered. Fast forward to September 26, 1935, a year and a half after the Tomozuru incident. In the so-called Fourth Fleet incident, several of Japan's new ships were heavily damaged when they hit a typhoon. The heaviest damage was the result of insufficient longitudinal strength and substandard welding. This ranged from bursted seams and bent hull plates right up to destroyers having their bow snap off. As a result, many brand new ships of all sizes had to go right back in dock to have their frames and hulls stiffened or even replaced. As for Yubari herself, at roughly half the weight of the 5,500 tonners, though she was used operationally as a cruiser, she was essentially an experimental ship. She was meant to test these new ideas in regards to as much armament as possible. She carried nearly as many heavy guns as her larger predecessors on as light a hull as possible. Again, she introduced using the hull as armor. To help keep weight and thus cost down, she introduced the trunked funnel, which would become a standard on future ships. Being so small, though, like her predecessors, she had a forecastle deck that ran from the bow to the rear of the bridge to help keep her dry. She would be the last cruiser with a forecastle deck until the Katori-class training cruisers. Also, at such a small size, she reverted to the Tenryu's three-shaft propulsion. Yes, she was even lighter than the Tenryu's. At such a small size, it shouldn't be too surprising that she never carried any aircraft. Despite all of these weight savings, when completed, she still came in over her designed weight at 3,387 tons and was only capable of 34 knots rather than the 35.5 intended. Still, though, the Japanese were apparently happy, or at least happy enough with her. She introduced turrets to cruisers and destroyers. As an experimental ship, she was the prototype for the weak, deeply flawed design techniques on future cruisers and destroyers built up until the start of the war. Like I said before, with Yubari, Japan declared war on Archimedes, and it wasn't a fair fight. Yubari was started June 5, 1922, and completed July 31, 1923. Main armament was 6 140mm 50 caliber guns. These were arranged better than her predecessors, being in 4 mounts. All were on the center line, with guns 1 and 4 being single mounts. Mounts 2 and 3 were twins and superfired them. The single mounts were open-backed, hand-worked mounts, but the twins were fully enclosed power-operated turrets. This use of twin turrets meant Yubari had the same broadside as the previous 5,500-ton series, despite having one less gun due to having better firing arcs. Secondary armament was one 76mm 40 caliber anti-aircraft gun on a stand between the torpedo mounts. Torpedo armament was 2 twin 24-inch tubes on the center line between the funnel and the number 3 turret for the Type 82 torpedo. This meant they could fire off either side, effectively giving her the same torpedo broadside as previous cruisers that had twice as many tubes, but only able to fire half off each side. She could also carry up to 34 mines. Propulsion was provided by 8 boilers in 3 lateral rooms. The forward room held 2 coal-fired boilers. The middle room contained 4 large oil-fired boilers. The rear room contained 2 more oil-burning boilers. All 3 rooms vented to 2 funnels that trunked together. They provided steam to the 3 turbines to produce 57,900 horsepower. The turbines were in 2 lateral rooms laid out behind the boiler rooms. The forward engine room housed the 2 turbines that ran the outer shafts, while the rear room had the turbine that ran the middle shaft. Top speed upon completion was 34 knots, and she used 1 rudder. Armor was about the same as previous ships, even if it was laid out differently. Side armor was 57mm thick. In keeping with the principle of armor as hull, this was really just the inner layer of the double bottom, bending up and thickening to 57mm just below the waterline up to the armored deck alongside the boiler and turbine rooms. Deck armor was 25mm thick and really just roofed off the side armor. Modifications were light. In 1924, the funnel was raised 2 meters to try to keep smoke out of the bridge. From early September of 1932 through late January of 1933, the 76mm anti-aircraft gun was removed. In mid-1934, the mines were removed and permanent ballast was added. Much work was done to stiffen her frame and hull. Displacement rose to 3,600 tons and speed fell to 32 knots. In March of 1944, both single 140mm guns were removed. The forward one was replaced by a 120mm 45 caliber anti-aircraft gun, and the rear one was replaced by a triple 25mm mount. 2 depth charge racks for 36 depth charges and Type 22 radar was also fitted. Displacement rose to 4,448 tons. Yubari spent the first month of the war with Tenryu and Tatsuda leading the 2 invasions of Wake. In January of 1942, she helped cover the invasion of the Northern Solomons. In early March, she led the invasion of New Guinea at Lae and Salamaua. While there on the morning of March 10th, she was attacked by planes from the carrier Yorktown, which had flown over the Owen Stanley Mountains down the center of the island. As a result of several strafing runs, her number 2 turret was destroyed and a large fire was started midship. The damage was bad, but not fatal. Repairs at Truk took until the end of April. At the start of May, she led the Port Moresby invasion force, but after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the operation was called off, so, still with Tenryu and Tatsuda, she returned to Japan for refit. Back at Rubal in early July, she led the force that landed airfield construction units and troops on Guadalcanal. In early August, she took part in the Battle of Savo Island. In late August, she led the invasion of Ocean and Nauru Islands northeast of the Solomons. She then spent the rest of the year patrolling around the South Pacific before returning to Japan for a refit at the end of the year. With her overhaul and upgrades completed, she finally returned to Truk in late March of 1943 and promptly became a training ship. In early July, she led a destroyer group that bombarded the American troops that had just landed on Rendova. While returning to port afterward, she hit a mine that caused serious shock damage to her hull and machinery. Repairs back in Japan would take until the end of October. Back at Rubal in early November of 1943, she was there when American carriers raided the island in mid-November, though she wasn't significantly damaged. With Rubal no longer defensible, she returned to Japan in mid-December for a refit and modifications that lasted until late March of 1944, a glaring indication of how overworked Japanese shipyards were. With overhaul completed in late March, she ferried troops first to the Marianas, then to Palau. At 10:05 a.m. on April 27, 1944, while southwest of Palau, she was hit starboard midship by a torpedo from the submarine Bluegill. The hit immediately flooded her forward boiler room, with the second one flooding soon afterward and knocking out all power. Despite efforts to save her, she finally sank bow first 24 hours later at 10:15 a.m. on April 28, 1944.